perhaps the most memorable part of The Phantom Menace was the pod race, in which a young Anakin Skywalker beat out a field of alien competitors to win his freedom. The two leading racers, Anakin and his rival Sebulba, are pretty well established by the film. However, many of their competitors, despite their brief appearances, were also given names in the film, and all of them were fleshed out in the expanded universe. We've posted brief snippets about all of them over on the community tab, and since a lot of you seem to have enjoyed that, we figured we'd go ahead and provide our 100% fact-based tier list of the different pod races from worst to best. We're going to be dividing the pod races into 3 categories: the ones that sucked, the ones that were decent, and the ones that were true legends of the sport. We also won't be discussing Anakin or Sebulba today, since you're probably familiar with them already, and excluding them will make the last section a bit more interesting. With all that out of the way, let's get into it.
Attention, Sergeant on deck!
Let's start off with the worst of the bunch, which will be a fairly short section. Down at the bottom is Clegg Holdfast, a journalist turned racer who used his connections to make up for his relative lack of skill. Holdfast wrote for Pod Racing Quarterly, and he raced pretty much exclusively as a way of gathering information from the other racers. This gave him a reputation as a bit of a joke, however, which the prideful Nosorian didn't take too kindly to. He entered the 32 BBY Boonta Eve Classic to prove himself, only for Sebulba to flash his pod's flame jets at Holdfast, crippling his pod racer and causing him to crash. However, Holdfast was able to use his connections to alter the race records, retroactively giving him the 7th place spot. For this reason, we've put him dead last. Not far above Holdfast was RAAARGH Bumpy Roos, an aggressive but profoundly stupid Knock-Knock. Roos wasn't a terrible racer, but his approach to pod racing was often counterintuitive, and he became fixated on revenge after nearly losing to Anakin Skywalker in one race, which he was thoroughly mocked for. His way of handling this was to attempt to kill the boy by sabotaging his pod right before the Boonta, but he ended up sabotaging Ben Quadinaros' pod instead. Skywalker ended up winning the race, while a bumpy Roos crashed into fellow pod racer Dud Bolt and had to be taken into intensive care. Next up is Juan Sandaj of Ord Radama, a being of extreme ambition and questionable skill. As a Devlik, Sandaj had a life expectancy of only 10 years, and he became determined to make his short life mean something by defeating Sebulba and becoming a pod racing legend. A bit of an odd career path, given that Sandaj, like most Devliks, had pretty much no sense of direction when off Ord Radama. To defeat Sebulba, Sandaj hired the assassin Aldar Bedo to murder the Dug during the race. This plot failed, of course, and when Sandaj veered off course during the race, ultimately crashing into a Jawa sandcrawler. Near the top of the first section, we have Ben Quadinaros, a somewhat timid Tong racer who usually only raced safe, wimpy tracks. He entered the Boonta last minute with a rented pod racer after Bowles Raw bet him 5 million peggats to do so. Perhaps fortunately for Quadinaros, his pod was mistakenly sabotaged by Bumpy Roos before the race, and as a result, Quadinaros got stuck at the starting line. This performance made Ben the butt of many jokes, but in fairness, he did get the last laugh, seeing as he walked away from the Boonta 5 million peggats richer. The best of the worst was Never Key, an eccentric pilot known for the insanely unsafe design of his pod racer. Key was renowned as a daring pilot, but his performance in the Boonta was less than spectacular, as he was consistently stuck at the back of the pack. Near the end of lap 2, Key actually straight up disappeared, flying off course into the sunset, never to be seen again. That's legendary behavior, but it's a poor pod racing performance nonetheless. Now we move up into the ranks of the more competent pod racers, beginning with the late Rats Tyrell. Tyrell was an Alina who, unlike many pod racers, insisted on playing fair, and he was actually a pretty good racer, all things considered. However, Rats Tyrell was most well known for his fatal crash in Laguna Caves, which traumatized his family and inspired his son to start a campaign to to ban pod racing altogether, which was eventually successful. Above Tyrell, we have not one, not two, but 3 assassins who used pod racing to kill their targets. Of these, Eldar Beto was probably the best at actually racing. He placed 3rd in the Bunta, though he failed to kill his assigned target, Sebulba, during the race. Another racer, Ilan Mak, was actually the son of a crime lord out for revenge against Beto for killing his father, and he entered the race to get a shot at him. Mak failed to kill Beto, but he placed 5th and discovered that he was actually quite good at pod racing, which led to him starting a genuine career in the sport. The 3rd thug at the Bunta, Dud Bolt, was actually hired by Sebulba as a bodyguard for the race, tasked with taking out anyone who threatened the Dug's lead. Bolt was also a fairly competent racer, though he crashed in the Bunta when his pod collided with bumpy roosters. All 3 of these racers were pretty good, but we've lowered their ranks a little to account for their status as assassins using the sport as cover. Odie Mandrell was one of the better pilots to participate in the Bunta, though he was unable to finish due to a pit droid getting sucked into one of his engines and crippling it. Mandrell was highly competent, however, infamous for his virtually suicidal maneuvering and for always traveling at top speed. He was on a similar tier to Mars Guo and Timto Pagalais, both of whom were also skilled but crashed during the race. Guo due to sabotage from Sebulba, and Pagalais due to getting shot down by sand people. We'd rank them a little ahead of Mandrell, however, because both of these pilots performed quite well despite not being entirely sober. Pagalais went on a bender literally right before the Bunta and was thoroughly hammered all through the race, while Mars Guo had done the same thing the night before and had a massive hangover on race day. Guo in particular might have taken one of the top spots despite his hangover were it not for Sebulba. Now we move on to the best of the best. The most legendary racers of the 32 BBY Bunta after Anakin and Sebulba. We'll start with Ebe Endcott, a bizarre looking fellow without all that much of a story. Though Endcott wasn't flashy, he was very good at pod racing, and he placed 4th in the Bunta. He was perfectly satisfied with this result, as all he really cared about was beating Sebulba, who ultimately crashed and thus didn't place at all. Above Endcott, we have Morhonic, one of Sebulba's top rivals. Morhonic was another skilled but not terribly flashy racer, and he was one of the few racers that Sebulba actually considered a threat to his career. For this reason, and perhaps also because Morhonic was a Gran, the longtime enemies of the Dugs, Sebulba made Morhonic his first target during the 32 BBY Bunta Eve Classic, forcing the Gran to crash during the first lap. Morhonic survived, however, and he ultimately sought revenge by posting bounties on Sebulba and his whole family. In second place, we have Bowles Raw, who barely appeared in the film but was identified as the winner of 2 previous Bunta Eve Classics. Raw was a racing legend, having won many high-stakes races with his extreme skill, and he was also an accomplished singer. Raw only placed 6th in the 32 BBY Bunta, but his record of having won 2 previous races suggests that this was an unusually subpar performance. Our top racer, meanwhile, was Gasgano, one of the most skilled pod racers in the history of the sport. Though Gasgano more or less stayed out of the spotlight in the 32 BBY Bunta Eve Classic, he walked away with the 2nd place title, and he went on to win a slew of other highly competitive races thereafter, usurping Sebulba's old spot as top pod racer. Gasgano could get mean when provoked, but unlike Sebulba, who preferred to sabotage his way to victory, Gasgano usually preferred to simply outrace his opponents, which he did quite often. Because of this, he emerged from the 32 BBY Bunta Eve Classic as one of the undisputed leaders of the sport and one of the greatest pod racers of all time. So, that's our look at all the pod racers of episode 1, minus Anakin and Sebulba. But what do you think? Are there other background characters you think we should make tier lists of? Let us know in the comment section below. And as always guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.